Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's Tuesday topic. Today's topic is From Design to Dissemination, Stopping Fraudulent Participants in Their Tracks, with Professor Justine Sefcik is our moderator, and we have some guests from Wake Forest University, Dr. Erica Frechman and Harleah Buck from the University of Iowa. So while we're waiting for a few more people to join us and for everyone's microphones to kick in and settle in, let me just plug next week's Tuesday topic. Next week's topic is going to be kind of an interesting event. It's a screening of a film, PBS film called Aging in America, Survive or Thrive. So we're going to screen the film from 3 to 4. It's about an hour long. And then we're going to have a panel discussion about the things that come up in the movie. It's a very great film, and we hope you'll join us for that. All right, so without further ado, let me throw it over to Dr. Justine Sefcik. Dr. Sefcik, take it away.
Great, thank you. And thank you everybody for joining today. This topic we're talking about from design to dissemination, stopping fraudulent participants in their tracks. This is a passionate topic of mine, having experienced fraudulent research participants. And so I just want to take a moment and share my story, and then I'll have my two co-presenters introduce themselves and share their story. So when I was a postdoctoral research fellow, I was conducting some qualitative interviews for the PI, and I spent a whole day, a whole Friday interviewing people. They were on the schedule. And about the third or fourth interview in, I said, oh, we have a problem. I was starting to hear repetitive stories from the participants that we were interviewing. And then I was hearing stories that just didn't make sense. So I had two participants, back-to-back interviews, that told me they were caring for their teenage brother who is living with dementia and a chronic wound. And we know that there's no known cases of teenagers living with dementia. And the first participant, I was thinking, oh, maybe he misunderstands, and maybe it was a traumatic brain injury because he had told me his brother had played football. But once I got to that next participant who told me a very similar story, I said, we have a problem. And I had participants who were not putting their cameras on. They had poor quality of their audio, and they sounded like they were shuffling papers. So as if somebody had from this group had recorded me or written down questions. And so the respondents were trying to answer off of papers. And so I ended up publishing a paper on it, and it was about how snowball sampling leads to an avalanche of fraudulent participants, because I was so mad that I spent an entire day interviewing people and I couldn't use their data. And it was unbelievable. And as a qualitative researcher, you really want to believe your participants, but there were so many red flags in those conversations. And it was a snowball sample. So we had a participant who had told me his story, his caregiving story, and there weren't any particular red flags in that story. And he said to us, oh, I know other people in a similar caregiving experience. Would you like to interview them? And we said, yes, like we want to get research participants. And so the project manager set up all these interviews for me. We were thinking maybe this was part of a support group that he had reached out to, and only to find out that it was a whole ring of fraudulent research participants. And so, so I've taken on this topic, and I would love to pass it on to my co-presenters that could introduce themselves and talk a little bit about their experience.
I can go next.
Yes, thank you.
Sure. I'm Erica Frechman. I'm assistant professor of gerontology and geriatrics. Thank you for inviting me here today. And my experience with fraudulent research started with my dissertation study. And so my study looked at examining how older adults prepare and plan for aging and frailty. It was a multi-method study, and I experienced fraud in the survey portion of the study. So my setting was based in the community with 2 YMCA sites and 1 senior center. For my recruitment methods, I used flyers at each community site. I posted on social media through each location, and I also used the email listserv associated with all those sites. So my survey was administered through REDCap. And along with my participation, I offered a $25 incentive for those survey participants. And that information was included on all the recruitment materials. So, as a PhD student, I was just so excited to be ready to start and kick off my study. And, when I pressed that activate, let's go sign, I started getting excited. Within like 45 minutes, I had some people already taking it. I was notified every time someone took the survey on RedCap, I got an email. So within like an hour and a half, I had over 300 respondents, and I was like, something is going on. This is getting crazy. And I actually got a weird message sent to me directly on social media saying your survey has been hacked. So, within 5 hours, I had over 1,000 response. It was very frightful. I didn't understand what was going on. Of course, I reached out to my chair and my committee members and kind of started the process, but I had to shut down and kind of look at what happened. Then I, educated myself and learned more about fraudulent research and put into place ways to mitigate the fraud. And I actually had another experience of the fraud despite taking those steps. So that was a very frustrating experience. In that second time, I went through a different process trying to see was there real participants here versus the first one. It happened so fast. I had so many respondents. I knew it was bots, and I had to discard all of that. But this second time, I was able to comb through the responses and look what might be real. And I ended up calling all participants to try to save some of that data. And then from that experience, I didn't want to go through it a third time, so I actually pivoted to use a different way to recruit. So overall, I think this experience dealing with fraud, it's applicable for students to experienced researchers. I learned for any future studies, whether I'm looking at quantitative data or qualitative data, the steps to try to mitigate this happening. I think it's happening more and more, but just educating yourself and your study team members is a great first step. So thank you all for being here.
And my name is Dr. Leah Buck. I'm the Sally Mathis Hartwig Professor of Nursing in the University of Iowa, and I also direct the Barbara and Richard Somé Center for Gerontological Excellence. And I experienced secondary fraud as a member of Erica's committee and getting a chance to see it up close and personal and overhearing Justine talk about her experiences. But I'm currently funded on an R21 from an ANR. And because of my exposure through these two individuals, I was able to spot very quickly that our current study was undergoing fraudulent participants, and were able to close that down very quickly. And we were able to do a root cause analysis and discover, because we were using multiple methods of recruitment, really to be able to uncover where the problem started and then reporting back. It was a certain repository here on campus reporting back to say, you have a problem. And so it was kind of a full circle moment. So I'm really looking forward to hearing the conversation today on this presentation.
Great, thank you both. So I'm going to move our slide set forward here. And so I don't know, I guess it was at least a couple years ago where we all started talking about our fraudulent research participant experiences and the frustration. And we said, let's do a conference symposium together. And we were all members of the Gerontological Society of America. And so we put in a symposium, and we also reached out to our network and said, who else is having these similar experiences? And so we had a whole team together, put on a symposium, and our room was packed, which was amazing for a large conference like that. We tend to have smaller audiences because there's so many sessions happening at once. But we had a packed room of people who were interested in our story. So they were, participants. They were there to hear our stories and to learn what they could do to prevent fraud themselves because they were experiencing it. And as Erica mentioned, one of the reasons we've identified that people are misrepresenting themselves in research is so that they could get the financial incentives that we give, that as a thank you for people spending their time in studies. And so after the conference and the successful presentation, we said, all right, what are our next steps? We have to do something else about it because people are asking, well, what should we do? What can we do? And so we recently published a paper, and this QR code will bring you right to the paper. It's the early release of the paper. And it's called Gerontologists Combating Fraudulent Research Participants, Recommendations from Design to Dissemination. And it was published in the Gerontologist as an advanced copy. And today our topic is relevant to all researchers, but we came together in terms of everybody working in gerontology to put some recommendations forward. And so, as we've mentioned, this is a growing problem, and more, when I talk to my colleagues, they are facing fraudulent participants. And it's either people are providing false information to get into the studies, so maybe people are wanting an intervention that's provided that they might not have access to, so they might be misrepresenting themselves, but more so, we're seeing that people are motivated by the financial incentives we give. And then other people are creating these bots to complete our surveys. And honestly, I don't know what their motivations are, especially if they're not getting a financial incentive. Some are, but not all to complete surveys. And we know that this is problematic because it threatens our research integrity and it's wasting our resources, especially when our studies are funded by the government and we have sample sizes that we have to reach. This creates major problems when we identify that we do not have authentic research participants. And this problem has particularly grown more so since COVID, because a lot of research has moved online, particularly with qualitative research. We used to do a lot of interviews in person, and now due to the ease and convenience and people being more experienced with technology, we tend to run our interviews online now. And what is our overall impact? You heard me say we couldn't use any of the data, and we heard from Erica as well for a dissertation study not being able to use any of that data. It's for us as researchers, it's very devastating. So we've, in terms of coming up with the paper, we shared some of these common red flags that we've noticed during recruitment, enrollment, and data collection. And so from hearing our stories, you're hearing that sudden surge in interest. And that's a red flag for all of us because recruitment is really hard. But when all of a sudden you get a quick uptick in participants, you want to investigate and find out why. And then we're seeing when surveys are being conducted, unusually fast completion time is a red flag. With the bots, they're doing batch responses and you'll find identical patterns in there. For qualitative interviews, we're finding nonsensical responses. So people are responding to our questions with things that just don't make sense to us, and that having cameras off and poor audio is also a big red flag. And then when people are unable to answer simple eligibility questions, that is something that should be a red flag right from the beginning of your studies. And we'll talk more about that in terms of how do you mitigate this. And then it's just a threat to our data quality. So when we sat down as a team and thought, how can we address this? We came up with a two-phase approach. So one is in the participatory phase, so when we're designing our studies, and then the second is during the implementation phase. So when we design our studies, we want to try to have them as fraud resistant as possible. And so we're going to train our research teams on what are these red flags for fraud? What do we do when we identify fraud, such as shutting down a study or reviewing that data right away? We recommend that we partner with IRBs to see what their recommendations are. And each university, IRBs, has a different take on this. So partnering with them to see what's acceptable and not acceptable. We even have a recommendation to put into consent forms that if fraudulent participants are identified, that we would not pay that incentive. So you have to work with your IRB partners to see if that's acceptable. We are asking that people have a fraud detection plan in place, and that goes hand in hand in terms of training the team. And we also are recommending that we have university level training, so sessions like this and also sessions and conferences to make people more aware of the problem. And so in terms of implementing the study, as I said, that early detection is so important. You don't want to be weeks into data collection and identifying that you have a problem. You want to try to stop the problem right away. And so this requires regular data checks. And so you want to build that into your protocol and implement it. And there might be cases where you have to do participant verification. So actually calling people on the phone, sending follow-up emails to determine whether they are fraudulent or not, because we don't want to lose participants that are authentic, but maybe they didn't share their true story because they're embarrassed or they're worried about being judged. So we want to think carefully before we kick people out of our studies. It might be a little different in terms of surveys, but especially with qualitative interviews. And then what we're recommending is that people be transparent in the reporting and sharing in the dissemination. If you had fraudulent participants, what percentage of fraudulent participants did you have, and what did you do in terms of that data? And we're also recommending that people share their experiences so that we can learn from each other. So some key prevention strategies, we recommend verifying that the participants are authentic. And so that's doing phone or video calls to confirm their eligibility, doing, as I mentioned, updating the consents so that it's clear of the consequences if we identify fraud, having some quality control built in, especially with the surveys to detect fraud. There's a recommendation to delay payment. So if the participants know ahead of time that their financial incentive might be delayed for a couple weeks, they might be less willing, if they're a fraudulent participant, to participate in that study. We also believe that regular auditing should be built in so that we could keep checking our data, again, to make sure that the integrity of our data. And then our other recommendation is to involve community partners, because we want to be culturally sensitive to whatever study that we have. And for instance, with qualitative research, we might hear something that might not be clear to us, and we don't want to jump to conclusions that it is a fraudulent participant. It might be something that is common within that community. So having community partners could help us identify any problems with the data, or confirm that what we're hearing is accurate and that we have somebody who is correctly identifying themselves. And so in terms of our paper and our recommendations, and this is around all of the research integrity, what are the different roles? So we believe, starting right above in the top, that researchers should be proactively designing their studies and monitoring their studies to make sure that they do not have fraudulent participants. And if they do, how are they going to address it? We recommend that universities have mandatory training and resources available because this is becoming such a problem, making sure that everybody's aware and having a plan of how to deal with it. We think that professional organizations such as ours, like the Gerontological Society of America, should have some guidelines or training programs, or at least to host sessions at the conferences where people could share their experiences and learn from each other. In terms of graduate students, we believe that we should have a plan for the dissertation study ahead of time in case there are fraudulent participants, and how will we address that? For IRBs, we believe that they should have some support for us in terms of fraud detection policies that are available, either posted online or that could be shared over email with investigators. And then we also believe that funders should require a fraud detection plan in their grants. So forcing researchers to think about this ahead of time, because it is so problematic. And then I'm going to pass it over to Erica.
Sure. When we look at detection methods for surveys, we have highlighted some aspects to be aware of. So the first one is to monitor completion times versus human baseline. So for example, in my study, the fraudulent responses, the time that it took to complete the survey was 1 minute, 4 minutes, 5 minutes, 7 minutes. And this was a 65 question survey. And when the survey was validated, the average time to completion was 15 to 25 minutes. So that was a red flag right away. Another element is to use paradata to identify bot patterns. And when we talk about paradata, that refers to the additional data collected during the research process that provides information on how the survey responses are gathered, and includes data such as the time taken to complete a survey. It may be the timestamp on when they took the survey. It could be related to response patterns as well. Another aspect to consider is to contact suspicious participants for verification. So if you are suspicious of the response. Usually if there's an incentive involved or you're trying to contact these participants, there may be an email or phone number. So reaching out to them to verify. And then also in that process to remove the confirmed fraudulent responses so you can uphold the integrity of your data. Next slide.
So in terms of qualitative interviews, and this is where I have my expertise, we should be reviewing the transcripts for inconsistency, and we should do this pretty early on if you have multiple interviewers. So in my case, with my previous experience with fraudulent participants, I think that it was caught pretty early because I was the consistent interviewer and I was hearing these problems over time. And we actually had a whole Monday filled with participants too signed up. And so we were able to pause the study on the Friday when I identified problems and then cancel all the interviews on Monday and meet as a team and figure out what to do. So if you have a situation, because every team runs differently, and maybe you have research assistants who are doing multiple research assistants who are doing interviews, you should meet with them frequently so they could do a comparison of their interviews and make sure that there aren't these inconsistencies or nonsensical responses. We also want to follow up with participants when possible. So again, instead of jumping to conclusions that we have fraudulent participants, we might want to reach back out and say, hey, I was thinking about our interview and you said something that I'm just not sure of. Can you explain that further to me? We would want to have that in the IRB consent form, though, making sure that we could follow back up with participants and have their permission. The other thing we want to consider is cultural and personal factors. So again, just not eliminating people by jumping to conclusions, but really think through why we might be getting the data that we're getting and evaluating it on a case-by-case basis. So again, person by person. And what we have done based on previous experience and now moving forward is that we have a more stringent inclusion, or not inclusion criteria, but screening process. And so when we had the people signed up for the following Monday, and we paused those interviews, and then we reached back out to them, and we actually had asked them to confirm some of the facts they told us the first time, such as the age of the person they were providing care for. And we were getting back inaccuracies. So if they said that their loved one was 73 on their first screening, and then we checked again on the second screening and they said their loved one was 50, we knew we had a big problem right there. And so those are some of the things that we've implemented in terms of qualitative interviews. So doing a more thorough screening. We were asking questions about wound care for the person living with dementia. And so in the screening process, finding out a few more details ahead of time before getting into the full interviews, just to make sure that the person could be articulate with and authentic in terms of what they were providing information for.
And going back to quantitative or survey studies, we did talk about looking at completion times, using paradata, and then contacting suspicious participants and removing those fraudulent responses. But other ways to incorporate, as we talked about, and that I utilize, is adding a reCAPTCHA to the survey. So that's where you have to check that box to prove that you're a human and not a bot. We talked about those quality control questions. And I also learned those are called kind of speed bumps, so or attention checks. So it's a way to thwart careless or computerized respondents. Oftentimes it may be, answer or somewhat disagree for this question. So someone has to purposely select that answer response. I've also seen for open-ended questions, they might ask you to type in a response. So that's another way to really make sure that the quality is upheld. And then I utilize REDCap for my survey management. And within REDCap, they have hidden items in the survey. So hidden items can be seen by the computer, but not the respondent. So if the items are completed, they're most likely completed by a bot. So I was able to incorporate that in my survey as well as just another measure to test for fraudulence. Next slide. So when we think about ethical considerations, we really have to be mindful of scenarios of ethical complexity that come with fraud detection. And some examples we've listed here. So for example, a father-son caregiver may share an IP address and narratives. And another example is cultural differences can appear suspicious. Another example, low literacy or English as a second language may cause us to be alerted whether this is fraud or not. Another example is to really avoid associating demographic patterns with fraud. And being wrongly excluded can erode trust in research. And for many individuals that participate in our study, this may be one of the few times that they have an opportunity to feel heard, valued, and included. So we really don't want to eliminate that trust in the research process if we can maintain it. So overall, as a team, we came up with the solution when considering ethical considerations on this topic to really engage community partners to ensure culturally sensitive detection strategies.
And what's really interesting about then beginning to implement the recommendations are that they're really pretty simple and straightforward. It's just a change in practice, which if we all adopt them as sort of a industry standard, very quickly can be integrated into our ongoing policies and procedures for studies. And so it's that idea, as you've heard us say already, about early warning, not waiting for this problem to show up later, but to be proactive and start looking at it through these daily data checks, particularly initially. And anytime, for example, it's not unusual to start with one recruitment strategy, and if it's not working in particular, to then add a second strategy. Every time a new recruitment strategy is added, to go back to the daily data checks will save a lot of headaches later. In your team meetings, discuss enrollment issues regularly, not just how many have we recruited this week, but also what the data quality was of any data collected. This idea of verification and building it into your normal processes to just say, before reimbursement, we're going to need to verify this information. So the important part is really, or the key actions that need to be taken, is that idea of pausing any data collection if there's even suspicion and doing that deeper dive into it. Talk to your IT department early on. Some of that paradata can also be IP addresses, and it's easy enough for them to run a report in if you are getting this is those patterns. If you are getting a bunch of responses out of one IP address, more than likely there's fraud involved. Maintain a list of red flags for team reference so that you can very quickly check against, hey, we're seeing these kind of things, and let's see if that's on the list of known problems. But to Erica's point about being careful that we're not excluding groups that shouldn't be excluded, that we don't remove data on the basis of one person's check, but that there would be a way to verify with at least 2 to 3 people before any data is removed. So those are things to keep in mind. Next slide, please. But I think the real takeaway for this presentation, and as we all came together, was this idea of normalizing participant fraud through transparency. It's not that it could be, because in some ways, particularly when we first discovered it as investigators, you kind of didn't want to talk to people about it because you didn't want to call your own data integrity into question. But it's this idea that transparency about us all talking about it allows us all to address the issue. Because in some ways, fraudulent participants in research meets the definition for a wicked problem. And what a wicked problem is, a problem that's not easily solved because it doesn't just occur on one level. It occurs on multiple levels, and it really requires multiple levels to work together. And I'd recommend you have the QR code at the beginning of this presentation for the paper. Pull the paper and particularly look at table 1 at the very end of this preprint. A lot, and I want to emphasize, a lot of work went into that table, but it really talks across the different system levels of where fraud can be a problem. It's not just on the shoulder of the principal investigators, but it also is something that funders should be engaged with, scientific reviewers should be engaged with, university systems from research offices to IRBs to programs to even instructors in the classroom who might be teaching on research design. Professional organizations need to be talking about it as well, because it will take all of us to really start to normalize, but also to address the problem. So share your experiences, talk about them, report them in your manuscripts. Report in your manuscripts if you had a robust fraud detection plan in place. Give yourself credit for that. As you present at conferences, speak openly about some of the lessons that you learned. Include it in your grant progress reports. Really showcase the steps that you make. Give yourself, once again, credit. It really goes to that idea of the rigor of the science. And it helps other researchers learn from the approaches that you have developed. Because really the benefit at the end of the day in an evidence-based environment is that it protects the evidence on which in healthcare a lot of clinical practice changes may take place. And so that transparency supports rigor, it prevents future fraud, it builds a scientific credibility, and I really think that it will reduce the individual shame that many of us experience, like I should have done better or I should have caught this sooner. Next slide, please. So just in conclusion, as we said, let's normalize things. That fraud in research, fraud is a research risk like any other. And if we learn about it in our research programs, research design programs, we know how to design for it. It's not any different than any other external threat to the validity of our study. Be aware is going to take a multi-level approach. As I mentioned a couple minutes ago, it's not just on the shoulders of the PIs. It's a problem that all of us, as we engage, even as a journal reviewer now, I am starting to look in the methods section to say, is there any mention about, a plan for fraud, or are they talking about fraud? And I will put that in my reviewers' comments. I'm really surprised that this group that used all of these online techniques did not address the issue of whether they did or did not have fraudulent participants and how they addressed them. And am really starting to ask for them to respond to that in some way. I think is for those of us who serve on study sections as well at NIH is to begin to ask those same questions. But let's all keep in mind, we need to balance the protection with inclusion, that we all really make it key that we don't exclude legitimate participants. Share our experiences, view it as a continuous quality improvement thing. We're all learning. The fraudsters evolve, so must we, because at the end of the day, we all want the same thing, that there's enhanced reliability and trustworthiness in our research, whether in our area of gerontology or in the area that you may be conducting research. And the last slide, please. We just put some added resources that our group have been involved with that address some of these topics just to assist you in ways. And I'll turn it back to you, Justine.
Great, thank you so much. I'm going to skip back over to our QR code. So hang on as there we are. So if anybody was late to arrive and wanted to scan the QR code, it'll bring up our paper. So now we're going to open it up for questions from the group. And I wasn't able to see the chat.
Justine, there's a question in the chat now from Anna about, does anyone have experience with Qualtrics surveys? We used it for a recent research project and had many issues. Anna, could you maybe give us a couple of those examples of issues so that if one or the other of us have had that?
Sure. Thank you for this presentation. It was really interesting and really struck a nerve because of our recent survey issues. I've been working on a Drexel research project and found that we had, I think, well over 300 responses to a survey. We were aiming for 100, so we thought, oh, great, we're really ahead of the game. And then as we looked closer at the data, found that a lot of the responses through Qualtrics were incomplete, for one, which I was surprised they even were allowed to be listed as part of the data. And so that was one issue. The reCAPTCHA score, it gives you a score from 0 to 1, I believe. And I think a higher score means more likely to be legitimate versus under a 0.5 is more likely to be fraudulent. So we did use that as part of our mechanism for sorting the data. But just some other things of finding, there's another tool within Qualtrics that we added kind of partway through, and I can't think of the name off the top of my head, but it was another method for identifying likely fraudulent responses. But just curious if anybody had used Qualtrics. Erica talked about REDCap. We did use reCAPTCHA, but still ended up with a lot of responses that we deemed fraudulent.
I have not used Qualtrics, but it sounds like each kind of computerized method has their own kind of tricks on what you could incorporate. I did find, even though I implemented, like we talked about, the reCAPTCHA, the quality control, the hidden items, I still was hacked for the second time. So, the fraudsters are very savvy, but there's an element of, you could put whatever protection that you can based on your computerized system, but it may be that you have to do that manual check, look for those flags, whether it's age, discrepancies on emails. I did also find on mine several associated emails. They were all Gmail and they seemed repetitive as well. So that was just a flag that I noted. Just sharing.
Thanks, Erica. Yeah, the emails were another red flag that we found, where it was, for example, George1@gmail.com, George2@gmail.com, all within quick succession.
Anna, I just put a URL into the chat because while you were presenting your information, the real thing, the key point is this is an evolving area, right? And so today's fraud is not tomorrow's fraud, and the day after there will be new fraud. So what I have found the most helpful across platforms is actually collecting the URLs for the programs that I'm using, because they tend to update their fraud detection in real time as soon as there's a complaint to it, because that's a threat to their business model when you think about it. So I put Qualtrics's URL into the chat, and they have a specific web page related to fraud detection with really nice screenshots associated, telling you exactly where to look, giving you tips and things like that. So that you may find that helpful.
Thank you. And yes, this is a website that we looked at maybe a couple months ago, and it definitely has changed even since then. So thank you.
Yeah, Leah, I think that's such a great point about how everybody's becoming more alert to these fraudulent participants, and even the software owner or designers. And for my fraudulent participants, we had used Research Match. And I've used Research Match successfully with other studies. And so we, as researchers and at Drexel here, we have our liaison who helps us post studies on this particular funded site where we can link up with participants who are interested in being on our study. So I've used it in the past, no problem, easy to recruit, but we got that one bad person from Research Match, and then that trickled and led to all of the fraudulent participants. And I know Research Match has been made aware of this, and they have worked to put some safeguards in place to help researchers as well. So I think that will be growing, that we will have partners helping us prevent this problem. Yeah, other questions? I think just posing it to the panel about other emerging technologies. Do you see AI possibly being a way to help us detect fraudulent participants in the future?
Maybe. I was curious in the qualitative realm and your initial paper you published, Justine, did you find that fraud was prevalent in the literature related to qualitative studies, or mostly surveys and quantitative?
Thank you. Yes. So when I first published that paper, there wasn't much in terms of qualitative research. It's mostly surveys-based fraud. But since that paper has come out, and it's been a couple years, it's been cited pretty often, about 40 citations already, and in other papers about qualitative research fraud. So the literature is growing on this problem, and it's mostly around case studies.
Well, and Erica, I liked your comment to Ben in the chat, because I had the same question, like, what? You can put hidden questions in? I have a hard enough time with red caps questions I can see. But thank you for adding that it actually is a tag that you can put in there. So that was really helpful. And I'll be sure to, next time I get in red cap, probably tomorrow, I have a research team meeting to say, hey, let's check this.
Yeah, great. I'm not seeing any other questions in the chat. So Darren, do you want to wrap us up?
Sure. Thank you, Justine and Dr. Buck and Dr. Frechman. This has been a really interesting discussion, and we thank you all for coming and joining us for today's Tuesday topic.